They were happy at first, but then he did the unthinkable, a true crime documentary. The perfect couple. Sarah Miller always believed she had it all. From the outside, her life seemed picture perfect. She was the epitome of grace and kindness, beloved by everyone in the small town of Maplewood. Jack Miller, her husband, was a well-respected businessman who had worked his way up from humble beginnings to become the owner of a thriving construction company. Their love story was the stuff of fairy tales, high school sweethearts who married young and built a life together from the ground up. Their home, a charming two-story house nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, was a reflection of their life together. Every detail, from the blooming rose garden Sarah tended to with care, to the perfectly manicured lawn Jack took pride in maintaining, spoke of their shared commitment to a life of harmony and happiness. They were the kind of couple that made others envious, the kind that seemed to have figured it all out. Inside the home, the walls were adorned with photographs capturing moments of their journey together. The day they moved into their first apartment, their wedding day, the birth of their daughter, Emily. Each photo told a story of love and partnership, of dreams realized and goals achieved. The Millers were known for hosting dinner parties where friends and neighbors would gather, laughing and enjoying the warmth of their hospitality. It was during these gatherings that people would often comment on how lucky Sarah and Jack were to have found each other. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life, there were cracks that only those closest to them could see. While Jack was charming and charismatic in public, those who knew him well noticed subtle changes in his behavior over the years. He had become more withdrawn, often retreating to his home office for hours on end, working late into the night. The man who once lavished Sarah with affection and attention now seemed distant, his mind always elsewhere. Sarah, ever the optimist, tried to brush off her concerns. She told herself that it was just the stress of running a business, that Jack was simply tired and needed time to himself. She took on the role of the supportive wife, always ready with a smile and a reassuring word. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted in her heart, a nagging feeling that something was wrong. Friends began to notice the changes as well. At social events, Jack no longer engaged in conversation as he once did. He would sit quietly, nursing a drink, his eyes distant and unfocused. When asked about it, Sarah would smile and say he was just tired, that everything was fine. But those closest to her could sense the tension that had begun to creep into their once perfect relationship. Despite the growing distance between them, Sarah remained committed to making their marriage work. She loved Jack with all her heart and believed that they could weather any storm together. She threw herself into her role as a mother and wife, hoping that by keeping everything in order, she could somehow bring Jack back to her. She planned family outings, cooked his favorite meals, and left little notes of encouragement for him to find. But Jack's behavior only grew more erratic. He began coming home later and later, often with the smell of alcohol on his breath. He became quick to anger, lashing out at the smallest things. The man who had once been her partner, her confidant, was slipping away from her, and no matter what she did, she couldn't seem to reach him. Sarah's heart ached with the realization that the life they had built together was crumbling before her eyes. She tried to talk to Jack, to find out what was bothering him, but he would brush her off, saying he was fine, just tired from work. He assured her that things would get better, that they just needed time. But Sarah could see the truth in his eyes. Jack was hiding something from her, and it was tearing their marriage apart. The once happy couple now lived in a house filled with silence and unspoken tension. The warmth that had once defined their relationship had been replaced with a cold, growing distance. Sarah began to wonder if the man she had married was still there, or if he had been lost to the darkness that seemed to have taken hold of him. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah could no longer ignore the reality of their situation. Something was deeply wrong, and she was powerless to stop it. She prayed for a miracle, for the man she loved to come back to her, but in her heart, she feared that the Jack she once knew was gone forever. The facade of their perfect life was beginning to crack, and beneath it lay a truth that would shatter everything Sarah had ever known. Cracks in the facade. As the seasons changed from summer to fall, so too did the atmosphere in the Miller household. The once vibrant energy that filled their home had dissipated, replaced by an unsettling quiet. Sarah tried to keep up appearances, but even her closest friends noticed the toll the strain was taking on her. She had lost weight, her once bright eyes now clouded with worry. Her smile, which had always come so easily, now seemed forced, as if she were trying to convince herself that everything was still okay. The distance between Sarah and Jack grew more pronounced with each passing day. He became increasingly absorbed in his work, spending long hours at the office or locked away in his study at home. When he was present, his mind was somewhere else far away from the life they had built together. Their conversations, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, had devolved into brief exchanges of necessary information. What time will you be home? Did you pick up Emily from school? Is the mortgage paid? The shift in Jack's behavior did not go unnoticed by their daughter, Emily. At 8 years old, she was perceptive enough to sense that something was wrong, though she couldn't fully understand what it was. The warmth she had once felt from her father had been replaced by a distant coldness. He no longer spent time playing with her in the yard or reading her bedtime stories. Instead, he seemed to avoid her, as if the very sight of her brought him pain. One evening, as Sarah prepared dinner, she overheard Emily asking Jack if he would help her with her homework. Jack, who was seated at the kitchen table staring blankly at his laptop, barely looked up before muttering, "Not now, Emily. I'm busy." The disappointment in Emily's eyes was like a knife to Sarah's heart. She had always prided herself on the close bond Jack and Emily shared, but now that bond seemed to be unraveling before her eyes. Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed, Sarah confronted Jack. She couldn't stand the silence, any longer the feeling that she was losing both her husband and her daughter. "Jack, what's happening to us?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're not the man I married. You're not the father Emily deserves. You're barely here anymore." Jack didn't respond immediately. He continued to stare at the screen of his laptop, his fingers tapping idly on the keyboard. Finally, he sighed and closed the laptop with a snap. "I'm just tired, Sarah," he said, rubbing his temples as if to stave off a headache. "Work has been stressful, and I'm trying to keep everything together." Sarah's frustration boiled over. "This isn't just about work, Jack. You're shutting us out. You're shutting me out. I don't even know who you are anymore." Jack looked at her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and irritation. "I'm doing the best I can," he said, his voice low and strained. "I'm under a lot of pressure, and I don't need you adding to it." The words stung, and Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had always been supportive of Jack, always stood by him through thick and thin. But now, she felt like she was drowning in the distance between them, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't reach him. "I'm not trying to add to your stress," Sarah said softly, her voice breaking. "I just want to help. I want us to be okay." Jack's expression softened for a moment, and he reached out to take her hand. "I know, Sarah. I know you mean well. But I need you to trust me. I need you to give me space to figure things out." Sarah nodded, though her heart was heavy with doubt. She wanted to believe Jack, to trust that he was telling her the truth. But something in his eyes, something dark and distant, told her that there was more to his story than he was letting on. As the weeks passed, the tension in their home only grew. Jack's late nights became more frequent, and when he did come home, he was often irritable and short-tempered. He snapped at Sarah over the smallest things: an overcooked dinner, a misplaced set of keys. His anger flared unpredictably, leaving Sarah walking on eggshells, never knowing when she might set him off. One night, after another tense dinner where Jack barely spoke, Sarah decided she couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers, and she was determined to get them. After Jack had retreated to his study, Sarah quietly followed him. She hesitated outside the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the low hum of his voice. He was on the phone, but she couldn't make out what he was saying. As she inched closer, the words became clearer. "I told you I'd handle it. No, she doesn't suspect anything. Just keep quiet and let me take care of this." Sarah's blood ran cold. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. What was Jack talking about? Who was he speaking to? The conversation was brief, and Sarah quickly moved away from the door before Jack could catch her eavesdropping. She rushed to their bedroom, her mind racing with possibilities. What was Jack hiding? And who was the person on the other end of the line? That night, as she lay in bed beside him, her mind replayed the conversation over and over. Every doubt, every suspicion she had tried to suppress, came flooding back. She couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that something was terribly, terribly wrong. But confronting Jack directly seemed impossible. His temper had become too unpredictable, and she feared what might happen if she pushed him too far. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She would start digging quietly on her own. She needed to know the truth, whatever it might be. But as she embarked on this secret investigation, she had no idea just how deep the darkness in Jack's life ran or how close she was to uncovering something that would change everything. The turning point. Sarah Miller's unease had evolved from a subtle feeling to a gnawing dread that she could no longer ignore. Every time she looked at Jack, she saw a man she didn't recognize, a man who seemed to be hiding something dark and destructive. But what troubled her most was the realization that this wasn't just about their marriage anymore. Something far more sinister was at play, and she had to find out what it was before it was too late. After overhearing Jack's mysterious phone conversation, Sarah became increasingly vigilant. She began to watch him closely, looking for clues that might explain his erratic behavior. She noticed the way he would jump whenever his phone rang, how he would take calls in hushed tones behind closed doors, and how he would leave the house late at night with vague excuses. Her heart ached with suspicion, but she knew she couldn't confront him directly.
Not yet.
She needed more information, something concrete that she could point to when the time came to have that inevitable conversation. One evening, when Jack was out, Sarah decided to search his study. She had never invaded his privacy before, but desperate times called for desperate measures. As she entered the room, a wave of guilt washed over her, but she pushed it aside. This was about survival, now hers and Emily's. The study was a stark reflection of the man Jack had become, cold, orderly, and devoid of any personal touch. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books on business and finance, and his desk was immaculate, with everything in its place. Sarah began by rifling through the drawers of Jack's desk, her hands trembling as she did so. Most of the contents were mundane pens, notepads, business cards, but in the bottom drawer, she found something that made her heart skip a beat. It was a folder, thick with papers, and marked confidential. She hesitated for only a moment before opening it. The documents inside were complex and filled with legal jargon that Sarah didn't fully understand, but one thing was clear. These were contracts and agreements for financial transactions that Jack had never mentioned to her. Large sums of money were involved, far more than their usual income could justify. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to piece together what this could mean. Was Jack involved in something illegal? Was he in debt to someone dangerous? As she sifted through the papers, one document caught her eye. It was a life insurance policy on her. The payout was enormous, far beyond what they had originally agreed upon when they took out the policy years ago. Sarah's blood ran cold as she read the details. The policy had been updated recently, without her knowledge, and it was clear that if something were to happen to her, Jack would stand to gain a fortune. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they painted was too horrific to fully comprehend. Was Jack planning something terrible? Was she and Emily's safety in danger? The fear that had been gnawing at her for weeks suddenly became all too real, and she felt a rising panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She had to do something, but what? Confronting Jack now felt like a dangerous gamble. If he really was planning something, he might act impulsively if he thought she knew. But she couldn't just do nothing either. The risk was too great. The next few days were agonizing. Sarah tried to act normal, to keep up the pretense that everything was fine, but inside, she was falling apart. Every time Jack looked at her, she wondered if he was calculating how much longer he had to wait. Every time he left the house, she feared he might never come back, or worse, that he would come back with a plan to carry out whatever dark thoughts had taken root in his mind. Sarah knew she needed help, but she didn't know who to turn to. The thought of going to the police crossed her mind, But what would she tell them? That her husband was acting strangely, and she found some suspicious documents? She had no proof of any crime, just a gut feeling and a stack of papers that could easily be explained away as something benign. In the end, she decided to confide in the one person she trusted completely, her sister, Laura. Laura lived in the next town over, and though they didn't see each other as often as Sarah would have liked, they were close. Laura had always been the strong one, the one who could keep a cool head in a crisis. If anyone could help her figure out what to do, it was Laura. Sarah arranged to meet Laura at a coffee shop, far away from the prying eyes of anyone in their town. As she sat there, waiting for her sister to arrive, her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if Jack found out she was talking to Laura? What if he confronted her? What if it was already too late? When Laura finally arrived, Sarah felt a rush of relief. The sight of her sister's familiar face, with its calm and reassuring expression, was like a lifeline in a sea of chaos. As soon as Laura sat down, she knew something was wrong. "Sarah, you look terrible. What's going on?" Sarah tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She had rehearsed what she would say over and over, but now that the moment was here, it all seemed too overwhelming. She felt the tears welling up, and before she knew it, they were spilling down her cheeks. Laura reached across the table and took her hand. "It's okay. Just tell me what's going on. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Through her tears, Sarah began to tell Laura everything: the distance between her and Jack, the mysterious phone calls, the document she had found, and her growing fear that Jack was hiding something dark and dangerous. Laura listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. When Sarah finished, there was a long silence. Laura seemed to be processing everything, weighing the gravity of the situation. Finally, she spoke. "Sarah, you need to get out of there. Whatever Jack is up to, it's not safe for you or Emily to stay in that house." Sarah nodded, the words confirming what she had already known deep down. "But where do I go? What do I do?" "You come with me," Laura said firmly. "You and Emily pack your bags and come stay with me for a while. We'll figure out the next steps from there. But you can't go back to that house tonight. Not after what you've told me." The thought of leaving her home, of uprooting Emily's life, was heartbreaking, but Sarah knew Laura was right. The risk of staying was too great. "Okay," she agreed, her voice trembling. "I'll do it." That night, Sarah returned home with a plan. She would pack the essentials for her and Emily, tell Jack they were going to visit Laura for a few days, and then leave. She wouldn't let on that anything was wrong. She would act as though this was just a spontaneous trip, something to get her mind off things. But as she walked through the front door, she was met with a sight that made her heart stop. Jack was sitting in the living room, his face twisted in anger. His laptop was open on the coffee table, and Sarah could see that the screen displayed their bank account, with recent withdrawals she hadn't authorized. He looked up at her, his eyes cold and accusing. "Where were you, Sarah?" he demanded. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to come up with an explanation, but before she could say anything, Jack stood up, his posture menacing. "I know you've been snooping around. I know you've been talking to someone. What the hell do you think you're doing?" The terror Sarah had been trying to keep at bay now surged to the surface. She could see it in his eyes, the darkness, the danger she had feared all along. "Jack, But she never got the chance to finish her sentence. In a flash, Jack was on her, his hand around her throat, his grip tight and unyielding. Sarah struggled to breathe, her vision blurring as panic took hold. She tried to push him away, but he was too strong. "You think you can just leave me?" Jack hissed, his face inches from hers. "You think you can take my daughter and walk out of my life?" "I don't think so, Sarah. I don't think so." As her world began to fade into darkness, Sarah realized with horrifying clarity that she had been right all along. Jack was planning something unthinkable, and now, in this moment of sheer terror, it was happening. But just as she felt herself slipping away, the front door burst open and a voice shouted, "Let her go." It was Laura. She had followed Sarah home, too worried to leave her alone with Jack after everything she had heard. Jack hesitated, his grip loosening just enough for Sarah to gasp for air. In that split second, Laura lunged at him, knocking him off balance and sending them both crashing to the floor. Sarah collapsed to the ground, choking and coughing as she tried to regain her breath. She could hear the sounds of a struggle, Laura's voice raised in anger as she fought to subdue Jack. And then, the sound of sirens blaring, getting closer. Help had arrived. But the nightmare was far from over. The unraveling. The blaring sirens outside the Miller household seemed to echo the chaos that had just unfolded within. As the police stormed through the front door, Sarah, still gasping for breath, watched in a daze as two officers wrestled Jack to the ground, handcuffing him with swift precision. Laura knelt beside her, her face a mix of concern and anger, trying to comfort her while keeping an eye on Jack, who was now being dragged out of the house. Sarah's thoughts were a jumble of confusion, fear, and relief. She had come so close to the edge of something dark and terrifying, and now she found herself on the precipice of another uncertain journey, one that would involve not just surviving but understanding the full extent of the nightmare she had been living. The paramedics arrived soon after, gently insisting that Sarah go to the hospital to be checked out. She was bruised, her throat raw from Jack's grip, but the physical pain paled in comparison to the emotional devastation she felt. As they guided her to the ambulance, Laura stayed by her side, her presence a much-needed anchor in the storm. Emily, who had been mercifully asleep in her room during the ordeal, was awakened by the commotion and brought to the neighbor's house, away from the flashing lights and the chaos. Sarah's heart ached at the thought of explaining everything to her daughter. How could she tell her that the father she adored had turned into someone they couldn't trust, someone dangerous? At the hospital, the doctors confirmed that Sarah had no serious injuries, though the bruising on her neck would take time to heal. Laura held her hand as the doctor explained that she would need to rest, but all Sarah could think about was what would happen next. Jack had been arrested, but that was only the beginning. She had no idea what charges he might face or what evidence the police would uncover. And there was still so much she didn't understand, so much she needed to know. The next few days passed in a blur of police interviews, visits from social workers, and an overwhelming sense of disbelief. Jack remained in custody, held without bail due to the severity of the assault and the potential danger he posed. Sarah was asked to recount everything, every detail of Jack's behavior, every suspicion she had harbored, every piece of evidence she had found. She felt like she was reliving the nightmare over and over, each retelling forcing her to confront the terrifying reality of what her life had become. The police investigation quickly turned up more than Sarah had anticipated. Jack's business, which had once seemed so successful and above board, was revealed to be a front for a variety of illegal activities. There were shady deals, forged documents, and connections to people with criminal records. The financial documents Sarah had found were just the tip of the iceberg. Jack had been involved in money laundering, embezzlement, and worse activities that could land him in prison for a very long time. But it wasn't just Jack's business dealings that were under scrutiny. The police discovered that he had been taking out loans in Sarah's name, using her identity to secure large sums of money that had since disappeared. The life insurance policy was another piece of the puzzle, an indication that Jack had been planning for the worst-case scenario, possibly even considering ways to ensure he benefited financially from Sarah's death. As the investigation deepened, Sarah learned more about the man she had once loved. Jack had been living a double life, carefully hiding his illegal activities from her while presenting a facade of respectability to the world. The man who had once been her partner in every sense of the word had become a stranger, someone capable of unspeakable acts. The shock of these revelations left Sarah reeling. She had always thought she knew Jack, his strengths, his weaknesses, his dreams, but the truth was that she had only known the part of him that he had allowed her to see. The rest had been hidden away, locked behind a door she had never thought to open until it was too late. Amidst the legal proceedings and media attention, Sarah found herself struggling to come to terms with her new reality. The life she had built with Jack was gone, shattered into pieces that could never be put back together. The home they had shared was now just a reminder of all that had been lost, and she couldn't bear to return to it. Instead, she and Emily moved in with Laura, who had become her rock in the storm. But even in the safety of Laura's home, Sarah couldn't escape the nightmares that haunted her sleep. She would wake in a cold sweat, her mind filled with images of Jack's face twisted in anger, his hands reaching out to harm her. The fear was overwhelming, and she knew that it would take time, perhaps a lifetime, to heal from the trauma she had endured. Emily, too, was struggling. Though Sarah had done her best to shield her from the worst of it, Emily knew that something terrible had happened. She asked questions that Sarah couldn't answer, her young mind trying to make sense of a situation that defied explanation. The bond between mother and daughter grew stronger in those difficult days, as they clung to each other for comfort and reassurance. In the weeks that followed, the media descended on Maplewood, hungry for every detail of the Miller scandal. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, eager to capture the latest developments in what had quickly become the town's most notorious crime. Sarah found herself the subject of unwanted attention, her private pain turned into public spectacle. She avoided the news, unable to bear the headlines that reduced her life to a sensational story. As the trial approached, Sarah knew she would have to face Jack again. The thought filled her with dread, but she also felt a growing sense of resolve. She had survived his betrayal, his violence, and the destruction of her life as she knew it. Now, she had to find the strength to see this through, to make sure that Jack was held accountable for what he had done. The day of the trial was one of the hardest of Sarah's life. She sat in the courtroom, surrounded by strangers, as the prosecution laid out its case. Jack's defense team tried to paint him as a man under immense pressure, someone who had made mistakes but didn't deserve to lose everything. But the evidence was overwhelming, and as witness after witness testified, it became clear that Jack's crimes were far more extensive than anyone had realized. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, she felt a surge of anxiety. She had rehearsed her testimony with the prosecution, but nothing could prepare her for the moment when she would have to speak the truth about what Jack had done. As she took the stand, she avoided looking at him, focusing instead on the questions being asked. Her voice trembled at first, but as she recounted the events of that terrible night and the months leading up to it, she felt a growing strength. She had to do this for herself, for Emily, for the life they were trying to rebuild. Jack showed little emotion during the trial. He sat impassively as Sarah testified, his eyes cold and distant. It was as if the man she had loved was already gone, replaced by someone she couldn't even begin to understand. The finality of it all hit her as she stepped down from the witness stand. Whatever they had once shared, whatever love had existed between them, was now irrevocably lost. The trial concluded with a guilty verdict on all counts. Jack was sentenced to a long prison term, and as he was led away in handcuffs, Sarah felt a mix of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but the cost had been so high. Her life would never be the same, and the wounds left by Jack's betrayal would take years to heal. In the aftermath of the trial, Sarah focused on rebuilding her life. She and Emily moved to a new town, away from the memories of Maplewood and the scrutiny of the media. Laura remained by her side, offering support and helping her navigate the challenges of starting over. Slowly, day by day, Sarah began to find a new sense of normalcy. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of overwhelming grief and anger, but she was determined to create a better future for herself and her daughter. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Sarah knew one thing for sure: she would never again allow herself to be deceived by appearances. She had learned the hard way that even the most seemingly perfect lives can hide dark secrets, and she would carry that lesson with her as she moved forward. As she looked ahead to the future, Sarah resolved to reclaim her life from the shadows of the past. She had been broken, but she was not defeated. She would rise from the ashes of her old life, stronger and wiser, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.